Welcome to the Cardano Foundation in warm, sunny Switzerland, Blockchain Nation. It is a great honor for me to address our community and all the stakeholders out there with a bit of a summer update while we are melting in our chairs here. As you probably noticed, we've joined the Linux Foundation as a gold member, and we also had the pleasure of welcoming a few months back Dirk Hohndel. So how was that experience?
It's been an interesting learning experience, joining a completely new industry and new environment, talking to a lot of new people, learning a lot about new languages and new environments. It's been quite a ride for the last 3 months, but I'm super excited to be here.
And we are excited to having you here. So why is it actually important to have an open source expert as you to join the Cardano Foundation?
Well, I think one of the key things that we are looking for with a blockchain technology is a focus on decentralization. It's a focus on transparency. It's a focus on building something that is not controlled by a single entity, but that drives a future that is driven by a community. And if you look at these values, then open source and the blockchain industry or the blockchain communities are very much aligned. The fundamental idea of having an environment that invites other people in, not just a controlling entity, but anybody who is interested. And that makes it very transparent how decisions are being made and who is doing what and who is working on what, how does the technology work. And putting all this into a framework that allows us to collaborate openly and in a manner that is inviting to new stakeholders is very much something that is at the heart of open source and at the heart of blockchain.
This relates really well to the Cardano Foundation's mission. The Cardano Foundation's mission is really to anchor the Cardano blockchain into society and being really the base layer, the foundation for the future financial systems, but also social systems. And that really requires that somebody actually benefits from using the blockchain, and that there is a blockchain which not just works today, but also continuously evolve based on the feature sets up here. And that creates a gap, sort of a middle layer, which needs to mature before we really can capture this kind of development which you're speaking about. So based on your observations joining blockchain, what is the biggest differences between traditional open source and the observations you've seen in blockchain, not just with Cardano?
Well, so a lot of the blockchain code is under an open source license. You can find it on GitHub. And there is this perception that, oh, we're doing open source. But what it's missing is a lot of the social aspects of the way open source connects to people. Because open source is not just a license that you put on your code. Open source is a way you do development. Open source is basically a social experiment. It's this idea that you can have people work together and make decisions together, even though there is no reporting relationship between them. So it's not one company making decisions and assigning work to employees, or maybe a joint venture of two companies, but it's a community that jointly decides how to do things. And it's that aspect, that community aspect, that most blockchains today are lacking. And building an environment where people can trust each other without being related to each other in a business sense is really that incremental piece that we want to add to what we see in Cardano today. And to be honest, I haven't seen this in any of the blockchains, that they have a truly strong open source community built around the technology base. So it's a wonderful challenge, and it's why I'm here.
So maybe if we take one step back, just from my mind and just relating to what you're saying, what is the difference between open source and free software?
Well, so now it gets tricky. Free software was the original phrase that was used in the 1970s when Richard Stallman and the very, very early free software enthusiasts came up with this idea that you should have access to the sources of any software that you use, and that the core value is in the collaboration, in the ability to fix things, in working together to create a bigger whole. And when the computer industry evolved through the late 80s and early 90s, and more projects started using these free software licenses, there began to be a little bit of a rift where on the one hand you had people who are very, very ideological about this need for everything to be free, for anything proprietary being evil, and with a fairly narrow idea of what it meant to be part of this free software movement. And a lot of the companies who wanted to participate felt that this was fairly hostile to them. And so the more pragmatic part of the now open source world came up with this new term. And so the development of Linux and the establishing of truly a complete operating system that you can build out of free software and open source components was what triggered this. And so since the mid-90s, we talk a lot more about open source as the model in which we build software, which is very friendly to corporations being involved, very friendly to the idea of money being made in this space, and very much driven by the pragmatic desire to build great software with all the tools that are available.
And that also means that there's some kind of a relationship between a successful open source movement and social systems. And as we in Cardano Foundation and the Cardano protocol are looking at optimizing and upgrading social systems of the world, do you also see maybe a role where Cardano as a protocol cannot just go into open source and be more open sourced, but also actually be a part of that maybe base layer for open source going forward?
So this is an interesting question because open source certainly is a social movement, and it's a big equalizer. It creates a level playing field where you don't have to be part of a major corporation in order to be able to innovate on top of state-of-the-art technology. Today, no one sane would consider writing a new Unix kernel. Why would you do this? How could you possibly compete with what the community in Linux has created in the last 30 plus years? But at the same time, a lot of the decision making, a lot of the structures in how we do business around open source has a lot of opportunities for something like a blockchain to help us. For example, if you look at supply chain security and the ability to authenticate where your components come from, having a blockchain to track that would be a phenomenal improvement to the situation we have today. And another idea that has been discussed a lot is, so how can you actually make sure that maintainers of critical pieces of open source infrastructure get paid? Today, with the economic systems we have today, this is incredibly hard. GitHub has tried to establish this sponsorship setup, but it's clunky and it's inflexible, and it doesn't have that idea that it's very simple. Just as part of deploying software, you can give a little token of appreciation to the maintainers. So creating a blockchain-based ecosystem that allows you to do that, a micropayment for use of certain components, is another of the many ideas that we've been kicking around to bring new social values into the broader open source ecosystem by using blockchain technology.
Amazing. So I think one thing which I've been asked a lot as we are slowly maturing as an ecosystem, and the technology stack is maturing with incredible speed here before the Vassal hard fork and so on, is when we speak about open source and where it lies, it can lie at different places in the operating model. And I think one thing you and I have been speaking a lot about is that there's a value capture layer and a value creation layer.
Well, if you look at the bigger ecosystem, so if the whole industry, where does the Cardano Foundation fit into this?
So a lot of things has happened with blockchain, and since blockchain came with a promise. But what we see is that the operating models and the maturity and where blockchain fits are really coming into focus now. And it's becoming dominantly clear how the actual landscape is evolving. So what we have really on the top layer is what we call the value capture layer. And for us, this is really about how do we upgrade the systems of the world. And now the upgrading part is very different than the original idea about blockchain, where we are talking a lot about that we are going to expel, or we are going to kind of kill the old systems. We just have to realize that currently we are living on the spaceship we call Earth. We have no possibility of leaving, and Earth, or the spaceship, is so small that we actually need to kind of live together, and we need to respect 200 years of trade agreements, legislation, social conduct, social systems, and so on. So up here in this value capture layer, it's really about how do we upgrade the systems of the world. And there's really 4 operating models. There's one which is really brand new innovation, and we haven't really seen that yet. So complete new operating models. The other part is what we're seeing really maturing on the blockchains around us right now. So this is everything from initial stake pool offering to NFTs to the identity to governance to expression of value, the ability to send value, but also the ability to store things and have multiple different identities kind of connecting and signing off. But it's really a blockchain native layer. It doesn't connect outside of the blockchain very well. Then the third business model, which is very heavily emerging right now and where the Cardano Foundation is playing a big role, is how do we upgrade the existing operating models of businesses out there with a blockchain layer to it. So think a lot about how we're going from a centralized data storage to cloud, and now we're moving into blockchain. And it gives us more than just a storage. It gives us a way of authenticating, it gives us a way of governing, it gives us a way of collaborating across different jurisdictions, different companies, different operating models and so forth. So it's a much wider thing. And here we see that the companies are taking a little stream downstream in the business and putting blockchain into it. And the last but very, very interesting part is really about consuming the blockchain. So this is companies who don't use smart contracts, they don't use metadata, they just parcel the blockchain because a lot of information is suddenly available, which has always been protected, guarded away, because this was the secret source, is now on the blockchain, and that means that we now have forensic providers, we have all sorts of data layers, all sorts of ability for really working with the transparency layer the blockchain brings. All of that up there is really the value capture layer, and the Cardano Foundation needs to nip up into that, because only by that, the four business models up there being successful, it creates the opportunity that, I want to contribute. I do see there's a bigger value in blockchain utility. So it's really about understanding those operating models up there. Now, the layer below that is what we call the value creation layer. And if we start all the way in the engine room, in the blockchain layer, what we're trying to get to is a place where we are separating two very important parts from each other. One part is, let's call it the repos or the projects. It's basically the source code. And what is really important is that the source code itself has standards, it has a governing body around that, it has the ability to be used, and we want it to be used in as many aspects as possible, not just on the blockchain. Because the more enterprises, the more utility you find in the source code layer, or the repos as we also sometimes call it, the better it is for interoperability. And remember, the Cardano protocol has always been about interoperability. So the more we can do about actually getting contribution down here, but also other usage than just blockchain down there, the more robust it becomes when it gets ported into the actual blockchain. Now then comes the blockchain layer. And for us, what's really important is that, of course, that the blockchain is resilient and reliable, it's predictable, that it's always working, that it has a very high uptime, right? That you can really trust the genesis blocks in there, right? That is, it's a trust layer. It's about trust anchors. And the difference here is that when you have a centralized database repository, your trust anchor is your internal controls, is your ability to protect your database or your bare metal or the server environment you operate in. But with the blockchain, you really rely on the community. So it's not necessarily the technology which is important, it's the strength of your community. It's the ability of ensuring that the community has this trust anchor functionality in there. And that's why the stake pool operators are so important. That's why it's so important that the blockchain goes through, let's say, some checks and balances before the source code is, incorporated from the repos. That's why the hard fork combinator, which is so unique for the Cardano blockchain, becomes a value proposition which is unprecedented for other blockchains. But it also leaves with a room when you're saying you have a blockchain, a fully functioning blockchain, where you don't actually need any of the federated entities who originally incorporated this blockchain. They're not needed anymore. The blockchain will work without us. But how do you get to a place that the blockchain keeps evolving based on the feedback from the actual users? That you actually get into a process that the SIPs processes, and the value add of using the blockchain becomes so big, you are so reliable on the blockchain, that you want to be part of the table in the repos. You want to contribute to that. You want to contribute also to the blockchain layer. So now you're starting to get nearly like a circle of life which is operating in there. And that's exactly the sweet spot of the Cardano Foundation, where we're putting our focus on it. Because there is a financial service layer, which is extremely important because we have to use a utility token to get access to the blockchain utility, right? There is an infrastructure layer. There is a trust layer in there, right? So there is some connective tissue which allows you to really think about how you upgrade these systems of the world to something as alien as a blockchain, which is, augmented by a very strong code repository around that. And that is exactly the segment where the Cardano Foundation is going to do the most effort to ensure that it's not just crypto, it will also be a lot of crypto. It's not just tokens and all these blockchain native models who's going to be in the center. It's really going to be how do we anchor this beautiful blockchain into the financial and social systems of the world, and by that upgrading the whole world with a much better security architecture, a much more functional way of collaborating, and a way of giving the 2 to 3 billion people an identity who don't currently have an identity. And that brings them into not just financial systems, it also brings them into a place where they can vote, they can have a voice, right? And in this way, this becomes a much larger movement. But it's so important that you really understand these layers, because by understanding them, you also see where you can contribute in a much better way.
I love how the strategy goes bigger and bigger and bigger. But to bring it back a little bit, I think what you're saying is the Cardano Foundation is the facilitator between the open source world, where we create the code, we create the technology, the blockchain world, which creates that decentralized economic system that we use to store all these data, and then the real world use cases in different industries as it applies to different parts of society, different parts of the economy. And we bring these three distinct groups together and help them be successful on the Cardano blockchain.
That's correct. So we are the facilitator, but not just the facilitator, because we like speed and we see that there is a need in the world for doing that. We are also starting to build certain products, and these products really lies in the value creation space, and they only focus about one thing. How can we create a situation where an existing operating model or a new operating on the Cardano blockchain, that they can actually get much more utility out of the blockchain. So it's really about closing that, creating that glue. And we don't want to, hold on to those products we are building there forever. So it's not about us building a product and selling it. We are really a non-profit foundation, right? But it's about kickstarting this development, ensuring that when we are speaking to enterprises who has a specific need, which they need to to uphold, to actually use the blockchain for what the intent is. It's about capturing that feedback, ensuring that these tools, these Dockers, these APIs, these Explorers, or whatever that is, that these are actually being built as reference clients, being ported down into the open source repos, but also that if over time the community want to take that up and they can find a business model around that, that's amazing. We don't see this as a part of us. In the next 10 years, we see this as a part of ensuring that we can get this adoption, this enterprise adoption, and this, huge, amount of people adoption, which the blockchain actually can do with the promises of the Cardano stack today. So in many ways, we as the Cardano Foundation are encouraging also dApp developers and people up in the value capture layer to share best practices, to create standards. But when we speak about open source, it's really in the value creation part. Is that correct?
Well, I think we will see open source components everywhere. But I think in the value creation layer, in the base technology layer that builds the infrastructure that everyone needs to agree upon for this to work, open source is the very obvious answer. And frankly, the only answer that creates an infrastructure that you can trust. And an infrastructure that stays sustainable over time. And sustainable in both meanings of the word. I mean, obviously you want something that's from an ecological perspective sustainable, but you also have to think about longevity. What happens if certain people, certain companies change their business model, go into a different direction? How can you ensure that a single person, a single company doesn't become a single point of failure to an ecosystem like this? So in that layer, open source is the obvious model. One of the things that we've learned in other industries that have embraced open source over the last couple of decades is that very often the the idea of open source starts to drift up in the stack. So you have that base layer that is open source from the get-go, and where everyone believes this has to be open source, we have to collaborate. And then as you go higher up in the value stack, you start to see, again, shared components that a lot of people want to work on jointly. And then open source pops up again. And on the flip side, you will see specialized components that have much more narrow use cases, or are maybe the tool of monetization in a specific part of the software stack. They may stay proprietary.
Okay. So I think up in the value capture layer, there's really like 4 business models, a group we can start thinking about. So one is, brand new innovation, a new kind of Uber, or something who really kind of is an operating model we haven't seen before. The second one is what we're seeing can live only on a blockchain. So this will be the NFTs, the DEXs, really like it lives on the blockchain, it breathes on the blockchain, it executes on the blockchain. Then we have the third part is really people who start deploying smart contracts, using metadata, actually thinking about legacy businesses who is starting to upgrade, like when we upgraded from a centralized database to a cloud system, we're now upgrading from cloud into blockchain, and that means that it's not the whole business who's upgrading, but a part of the business. It could be a database, a reconciliation, a way to communicate with your clients, a way to manage vendors and so forth. And the fourth model is really about consuming the blockchain, because for the first time we actually have a database which is not just transparent but is also available, and that means that there will be a lot more data out there which is verified, standardized, which people actually can take and build a layer on top of that. In your kind of experience outside maybe the very blockchain native one, where do you see that open source maybe to start will flourish from the value capture side?
Well, so again, the key that you see here is whenever you have components that are shared between different parts of the ecosystem, whether it's different people building solutions using the same components, or if the components is maybe the bridge, the interface between 2 parts of your software stack, then very often that is a very good candidate for an open source development. But one of the things that you talked about is, I think, super interesting, which is this idea that we are looking at the utility of the blockchain here. And that very much extends this paradigm of the utility of any software component. And you ask yourself, how do you measure the success of your software component? It's the use that you get. And so to me here, if we look at our blockchain ecosystem, the use of those utility parts of our technology stack, to me, is a great reflection on the success of the blockchain. And now if you apply that to how does open source technology, open source community broaden the use, broaden the success, broaden the impact of a technology, the same logic applies. You can see that as you use open source in your specific component, you increase your likelihood of getting more and more people involved, of getting more traction, of getting more people building on your technology. And so you can lift up whatever segment of the ecosystem you're talking about.
That brings me to the point which I think we can be really proud of as an ecosystem. And that is when you look at our transactions and the amount of transactions we have. We not only have a lot of transactions compared to other blockchains, but we also have a different type of transactions. And we see that over 90% of the transactions done on the Cardano blockchain is more than just a value transfer. It's actually utilizing features such as metadata, native tokens, or such as smart contracts. So in many ways, that means that there's already a maturity looking towards actually the use of the utility of the blockchain going on in our ecosystem. And I think what we're really looking at is that the more that goes out and gets wider than just the native blockchain utility and goes into the existing world of business models, there comes some dependencies from supervision, oversight, control factors, and so on. There's a whole middle layer around APIs. Do you foresee also some of that can be open source, or how do we kickstart that?
Very hard to say this from the outside. So, I mean, if you look at what attracted me to the Cardano technology, to the Cardano blockchain, was this focus on utility, was this focus on becoming a building block of people creating economic values in their industry, in their context. And so if I apply my background from just system software, I will say absolutely, wherever you create these shared components, wherever you create something that you want to be transparent, that you want to have open governance, that you want to have a clear technology a roadmap that helps you understand what you can do today, what you can do tomorrow. Whenever you have these values come together, open source is likely going to be a great way to implement that. But it's often very hard from the get-go to predict, oh, over here and over there, this will be open source, because very often this happens organically as the community comes together and tries to find solutions for the problems that they run into. And one of the things that is very different here is that the link between the utility of the blockchain, the link between the use cases and direct economic value is much closer, much more immediate, as in so many other use cases. Not just in value transactions or NFT transactions, but in every single transaction, you have that micropayment for the transaction. So you have the need for a user of the blockchain to be able to manage a treasury, a pot of money that they use to then utilize the blockchain. And this direct interconnection between monetary value and a technology and the technology use in an algorithmic context, I think is something that is new and that other parts of the open source infrastructure haven't seen. And so I expect that this will lead to new and innovative ideas and maybe to different approaches to what we have seen in the more traditional LAMP stack or whatever you look at in traditional open source.
That brings me to one of the more important points where the Cardano Foundation really has stepped up and is really putting a lot of emphasis on solving. And that is the fact that cryptocurrencies do not need a blockchain. But a true blockchain actually do need a cryptocurrency. And these financial components which you're just speaking about becomes actually on one hand a huge advantage, but also a huge disadvantage, because we are forcing the adoption on the blockchain and saying that if you want to actually get value, utility out of the Cardano blockchain, you need to be able to store, to host, and to manage the utility token. And by doing that, it creates some downstream problems with certain legacy enterprises, but also with the enterprises who are springing up on the Cardano blockchain today. Therefore, one of the things we're really looking into is how do we ensure that not just exchanges has the ability to store ADA, but also to deploy ADA as it's meant to be. Meaning that you actually can deploy your ADA through a custody solution or a regulated custody solution in a smart contract or into metadata, because that's actually what the blockchain is designed to do. So I think this is a very, very valuable point, and one of the parts where we as the Cardano Foundation every day are taking the long walk and ensuring that that you're able to do that in the future. Because only by that you enable these operating models to flourish. And by the operating models is flourishing, you actually get an interest in participating in what I understand the social experiments of open source is.
And to me, one of the key things that we need to think about is as we bring in enterprise players, as we bring in experienced software companies, as we bring in companies that have a long tradition of working in open source, for them, this is the new element. The need to actually be able to deal with the utility token, the need to manage and secure and delegate their ability to pay for the transactions in a distributed network, in a cloud computing environment, in all of the ways we do software today will create new challenges for them. And whenever there are new challenges, you ask yourself, what are the interesting new solutions that you can build here? How does the existing technology get extended to solve these problems? And we have seen this over the last decade with the shift from traditional virtual machines to containers to fully distributed cloud native application development, and the challenges this created for maintaining just security keys to sign your transactions for something like this. So this is a very logical extension of that. But the difference here is that suddenly the token that you use is no longer an abstract signature, but it's a token that has a dedicated financial value. So suddenly in regulated industries, the regulator will have an opinion on how you manage that. Your treasurer may have an opinion of how you deal with that specific value. It's not just a payment that goes to Amazon or to Azure for using cloud computing, but it's actually a token that has obvious calculated value. And so to me, this is, once again, one of those fun places where the academic analysis of the problem is one thing, but the reality, how it works for the companies that interact with it, may be totally different.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that actually is panning out, because it leads to one of the other parts where the Cardano Foundation is really making a huge effort. And that is about how do we actually de-risk this financial component or this utility token component, that people can actually use that and have clarity, not just on the let's say the regulatory part, but also on some of the other parts downstream into the operating model. Whether we're speaking about value-added tax, whether we're speaking about, is it a service, is it not a service? How do I actually account for it? How does it lie on my balance sheet? Can I outsource certain services and so on? And I think this is where, in a certain way, we see a maturity of the ecosystem as more and more applications grow and foster, and they hire more people and they hire more developers. We also see that there's a two-strong push. One push is from the Cardano Foundation of bringing in enterprises to diversify the uses of the blockchain, and the other push is that we see that the existing dApp developers and community, the business models are maturing, and we are seeing fairly large mature business models actually thriving in the blockchain landscape, and suddenly there is a demand also for some of those solutions. You cannot just live in a corner of the internet or in the metaverse. You actually have to interact with wherever local environment you are based in. And I think there we will also get a lot of help from inspiration from not just open source, but from the interaction with enterprises and really listening to what are they actually needing and what is for them a value. Is it a value to do X, or is it more a value to have an identity and a governance? And we need to ensure that these feedback loops are coming down into the development of the core infrastructure stack, but also into the middle layer, which is connecting those.
I think one of the terms that you used here, which is de-risk, is something that is super familiar to the open source community. Because to us, it has always been about understanding in more detail, in more depth, what's actually happening, understanding the dependencies in our technology stack, and having this ability to see at any level, at any layer of the stack, who is controlling what, who is doing what, how does the software interact with real world entities, whether that's a sensor in a drilling machine or whether that's money on your account balance. But fundamentally, this idea of using open source, an open source community and open source software in order to de-risk your technology stack is a very, very familiar one. But the big challenge here to me is that this meeting of the worlds that you talk about. On the one hand, the enterprises who have a lot of experience with open source software, a lot of experience with more traditional software development models. And on the other hand, the dApp developers, the blockchain native people who come from a very different mindset and a very different approach to how they communicate with each other, how they expect to share their goals, and how they want to interact with other people working on the same problems. And so I think there is an interesting role for the Cardano Foundation to play to bring these two groups together, because they don't talk a lot today, and they come from very different parts of the life cycle of an industry, a very, very mature, very experienced group of developers, and a highly dynamic, highly innovative, very much new and young environment. So again, super exciting and certainly something where we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, I think in many ways it's not sufficient that we have the absolute best blockchain in terms of architecture, flexibility, and governance. You actually also need to have that middle layer, these developer tools, these APIs, these kind of connectors between your software stack today and your operating model, and the actual blockchain. And those themselves also need to be resilient, they need to be reliable, and they need to be predictable. Because you are actually, as a larger company, if you have an audit requirement or something like that, you actually need to prove that if you're going through some kind of a middle layer, that it actually does what it's supposed to do. And if your operating model actually is enterprise critical, well, you also actually need to ensure that it keeps being up. So the uptime, not just of the blockchain, but the uptime of this middle layer and these developer tools or whatever you're using to connect your operating model is extremely important.
And this is a challenge that we've seen in the open source world quite a few times. When you look at safety critical applications, whether that is the driving system in a car, that relies on open source components. You need to be able to prove to the regulators that you actually can fulfill the OSL requirements for safe software development in a safety critical environment. If you look at the pharma industry that is doing medication research, and the ability to show that their software stack actually fulfills the requirements of their regulators, has always been a challenge with an open source background. And so the open source community has worked for the last decade and a half to create the controls and the ability to talk the language that these regulators want to hear. And so I think that we will find ourselves reliving the same development in the Cardano blockchain as we start talking more to the regulators who want to understand how do these transactions work? How do we deal with the utility token? How is the value stored? How is the value tracked? How does this work across an enterprise that does distributed development and distributed deployment globally? What happens if this transaction happens here in this country or there in that country? What are the implications on taxation, on all of these seemingly small additional questions, but for an enterprise, critical questions that they need to have answers for. And so to me, the ability to get this blockchain not only technologically ready, but also ready for the enterprise users is really the big challenge that we have ahead.
In certain ways, we can think about this as classical business infrastructure. You need a certain business infrastructure in order to operate your business, in order to get a P&L, in order to satisfy your clients. And in the old world, the business infrastructure was, one part regulation, legislation, and tax, one part ERP systems and reporting and how those two kind of things collect, and the other part was really, business information and how do I actually turn, the data into the new gold or whatever we say, or the new oil, right? There's been many of these kind of analogies around that. And I think one of the things the Cardano Foundation has been doing for quite a while, and we might not have been vocal enough about, is that we are basically on a daily basis, we are answering questions to regulators, to exchanges, to banks, to enterprises, with descriptions about how does the blockchain actually work? Not the blockchain, but the actual Cardano blockchain, right? How does a transaction actually work? What does it mean that there is no slashing? Who actually has the governance, part figured out? Where are we on the maturity curve? What about VAT? What about those things? And it's clear we don't have all the answers to that, that facet of questions, and we will only get that over maybe a decade to come because there's a lot of moving things. But the demand for those questions, the demand of getting answers to those questions has, exponentially increased in the last year. And I think the reason why it's increased is because a lot of traditional companies, they started out with a centralized approach to blockchain, and they realized, well, there was a promise of blockchain, and we couldn't see the value. We could see a much better value in a centralized piece of software. Now there is a second promise of a blockchain, which is more of a permissionless, distributed, decentralized version, which Cardano represents. And there the value proposition is different. It's not about pipelining. It's not necessarily about transactions per second. No, it's about a different IT security infrastructure. It's about a different way of interacting with your vendors, with your contributors. And I think there, in certain ways, I do see that there's an overlap between successful open source projects with the needs of the businesses and what Cardano actually offers. Do you have any thoughts about that, being an outsider coming in and being with us now for 4 months?
Yeah, I think you very much summarized this idea that I kind of started with, which is transparency and open governance and a community that collaborates is at the core of a functioning permissionless blockchain, but it's also at the core of how open source software really works and has worked for the last few decades. And so to me, the opportunity that we have here is to bring these together, and the challenge that we have here is to make that an accelerator for success for our partners in this space. So yes, very much I see the transparency and the method of interacting openly and having an open governance and having an open technology roadmap and having a foundation, a grounding in open technology is at the core of what we're doing.
And I think this is specifically why the maturity of the open source of the Cardano protocol and blockchain is one of the large bets of the Cardano Foundation for 2022, but also 2023 and going forward. We do see these synergies between successful open source and a permissionless, decentralized blockchain. And by bringing those together, we are hoping we will get into a situation where the Cardano blockchain, not only from a technological perspective, but also from a contribution perspective, becomes the absolute leading blockchain in the future. And there's a much longer roadmap which brings security for large companies, but also for emerging new companies who will grow large over time, that they actually will be sitting with the technology of choice because they know that the development, they know they have a saying in feature requests, they can do a SIPs, there's an established process, there is a way to contribute into the base layer of the blockchain.
And I think bringing more outside contributors in, bringing more of our partners to not just use the blockchain, not just build on top of the blockchain, but help build the blockchain is a big part of that success. Because if you want to create that decentralized a future that is not just part of how your economic model works, but also how your software development model works. And this is something where the open source communities very much have shown us how to do that. And that's something that we want to learn from and that we want to bring into the Cardano blockchain. And that's why I'm here. And
this is why it's so exciting to have you here. Thank you very much, Dirk. It was a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you for listening. And we're looking forward to talking much more about all the exciting things happening in the blockchain nation, in the Cardano ecosystem, but also around the Cardano Foundation. Thank you very much.